Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Laude. Dr. Laude has been a chemistry professor for 30 years here at UT Austin, but he's also served in a variety of administrative roles, and he's been a leader in program reform at the undergraduate level at UT Austin for a long time. In 1996, he chaired the original committee that proposed an innovative teacher preparation program that you have all heard of, and that is UTeach. In 1999, he created the Texas Interdisciplinary Plan, we call it the TIP program, as a way to provide a small college learning environment for students with coming to the university with indicators for adversity. That program is still operating today. He was also instrumental in creating the Freshman Research Initiative, which you may have heard of. And then between 2012 and 2017, Dr. Laude joined the provost's office, and he was put in charge of improving four-year graduation rates at UT Austin. He expanded on the ideas that had been developed in building the TIP program to create a freshman year success and incentive-based scholarship program that coupled a sense of belonging with targeted academic support. And that initiative successfully increased four-year graduation rates at UT Austin from 52% to 66% during that short time period, and are now at 70%. Even more impressive were that the students who benefited most from these initiatives were Pell Grant eligible and first generation students, and their graduation rates improved from 40% to 60%. And I wanted to just put a plug in for this book. So David's work was recently featured in Paul Tuff's book, The Years That Matter Most, How College Makes or Breaks Us, which I highly recommend because it's a great read, also because it features some of the work that Dr. Laude is going to talk about today. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. David Laude.
Thank you, Kim. It's great to be here. I am more nervous than I have ever been giving a talk since I was trying to get a job as a professor, because I think at this particular point, I'm supposed to figure out what buttons to push at different times, and I'm not very good at that. When I'm teaching my class, they don't care if I screw up, but with you all, my goodness, look at all these people who are going to know I don't know how to use Zoom. I also have dogs outside that are going to start bashing against the windows. I have 4 children upstairs who are going to ignore the sign that says not to come down here. And I've got an internet that may or may not work. So I'm hopeful this will all turn out. I've been told that I'm to talk for about 30 minutes, but I was also told I can take as long as I would like. And that reminds me of, and for those of you who are old, I'm sure you understand this, there are 4 phases in my mind to how long we talk. When we first start teaching in a classroom, we don't know the material well enough to say very much. So we find ourselves oftentimes finishing before we've gotten to the end of the class period. Then we get to a phase where we actually know everything, to where we want to talk past the end of the hour because we know so much. And then we get to this phase where we synthesize it all together and think about it deeply and realize you can explain pretty much everything with very few words. And then we become old and feeble and we just start rambling and we just start telling stories. And that is now the stage that I'm in. So I just want the folks running this panel to understand that they have all the control. If at some point they want to stop me from being able to talk, just click a button and I'll be out of here. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is actually a variation on a talk I've given in several places about the student-centered classroom. And I've decided I want to personalize it. So what I'm going to do is hope to get this up on screen and share it with all of you. And if I can get a thumbs up from Kim that folks can see it. We have a thumbs up.
We can see it. If you could put it on slideshow. There you go. Perfect.
There we go. Great. So this is a talk called The Student-Centered Classroom. And I need to tell you something sort of interesting about me. I was an administrator for, I think, 21 or 22 years in both the dean's office and in the provost office, but I never stopped teaching. I always taught my 500 student section chemistry course every fall and spring. And I also always taught a research methods course, one very similar to the kind of course that's being taught as part of professional development for the UTeach program. So I was always around students while I was doing my work. And that in the end had a hugely profound effect on me, it turns out. What's going to end up happening here is I'm going to tell a story about how it is that I came to change after 25 years as a teacher into a completely different teacher, an epiphany that occurred in the fall of 2013 as a consequence of the work I was doing. So this prompts me then to want to put up my all-time favorite quote from Muriel Rukeyser: "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms," which is pretty great because I love to tell stories. And that's what I'm going to do today, is I'm going to try to personalize this for you. I'm no longer an administrator, so I don't have to be very careful about what I say and how I say it. And instead, I can put it into a storytelling mode for you. And the story I want to tell is my kind of self-absorbed journey to becoming a student-centered teacher. Now, I tell you this because before I was what I now call myself a student-centered teacher, I probably thought I was a student-centered teacher, but in fact, I was a teacher-centered teacher, as you're going to find out. And it was only as a consequence of my work as an administrator and being given access to data that it hit me full on that I needed to change in the way I approached the classroom. So I'm hopeful for all of you as you're listening that you can ask yourself about where you are on this journey. Some of you may have started as a student-centered teacher and that hasn't changed, and good for you. I'm really pleased. Some of you may be on that path right now and may recognize some of my experiences. And some of you, hopefully, will look at this and go, "Wow, I never thought about it that way. Maybe that's something that I need to start thinking about." But in order to do this, I have to set the frame for how it came to be the case that in the fall of 2013, I had my epiphany. And so toward that end, I need to tell you about what happened in 2012. I was minding my own business, working in the Dean's Office of Natural Sciences, when I got called to the provost office and asked if I would become what they called the champion of four-year graduation rates. To give you a sense about this, there was suddenly this notion out there among universities that students should graduate. And if you stop and think about it, up until sometime around 2010, 2012, most of us were agnostic to this. I was in my own college for many years caring about students, but I never bothered to look at the data to know how many of my students persisted to graduation in 4 years or in 6 years. And in fact, as data started to be uncovered around the country, we were in for some pretty shocking evidence that maybe we weren't doing the job that we all thought we were supposed to do. Now, there are certain institutions where you can be pretty sure people are going to graduate in 4 years. Those are almost exclusively elite privates, and some of it's because of the quality of the student and the quality of the resources, but a lot of it's because nobody wants to be able to come home and tell their parents, "I need another $75,000 because I didn't get my English class to graduate." So that's those elite privates. Then there are what people call the elite publics, and this is where UT was finding itself in trouble. It was finding itself in trouble because if you looked across at the elite privates, places like North Carolina or Michigan or Berkeley, they typically had four-year graduation rates that were well in excess of 70%. Meanwhile, if you looked across the country, and in particular for me, looking at the state of Texas, I was shocked to see how many institutions of higher education had four-year graduation rates that were 10 and 20%. And I think everybody had a big wake-up call that they had to do something about this specifically. Well, at UT Austin, the issue was one of accountability. Our UT system folks came along and let UT Austin know that if it wanted to think of itself as an elite public institution, then we should have comparable four-year graduation rates to North Carolina or Michigan. But the reality was that we were down at around 50%. And this had been a cultural thing that was there for a very long time at UT. A lot of people would argue that when you're paying only $10,000 a year for tuition, staying another year isn't that big a deal, especially if you get to live in Austin or especially if you get to go to football games in the fall back when our teams were good. And so that was just accepted. And the university had made a lot of effort put into trying to get those numbers away from 50%, but they had held steady for the better part of 10 or 15 years. So President Powers, now confronted with the expectation that they do something to improve things, did what all presidents do. We formed a committee chaired by Randy Deal, the Dean of Liberal Arts. And they worked for a year and put together a very thick report that basically had 3 takeaway messages: improve orientation, improve advising, and hire a champion of 4-year graduation rates. So that became me. I was the champion of 4-year graduation rates, and I was supposed to get us from 50% to 70% literally overnight. The incoming class of students for the class of for the year 2013 needed to graduate in the year 2017 at that 70% rate. So the question was, what am I going to do about this? Now, there are obvious things you can do when you want to improve graduation rates, like you can remove obstacles like not being able to register for courses because you have a library fine, or making sure students can get access to their courses. But there's also that whole issue of how you get people to work together. And since this is a science conference, I can throw out my favorite thermodynamic idea, which is that when you have a system, that system can exchange energy coming in or out, and that energy can be in 2 forms. It can be heat or it can be work. At UT Austin, there were lots of people who were working hard on student success, but it was mostly heat. They were working at cross purposes with each other a lot of time, so that when it all averaged itself out, student graduation rates didn't change. But if, in fact, we all work collectively to move things together with 4-year graduation rates as our goal, whether we liked it or not, then we could affect change. And that's what work is. So I was interested in us turning our heat into work. But even that wasn't enough for me, because I think I had an understanding of what really needed to happen on this campus. And that was to work with the student populations that were least likely to graduate. The reality is that students coming from affluence, as Paul Tough points out in his book, graduate at rates far, far higher than those for students coming from underserved communities. So the question was, how were we going to get to where we needed to go if, in fact, when I went into the provost office, first-generation students, students of color, Pell Grant eligible students were graduating at about 1 in 3 in 4 years compared to 2 in 3 for advantaged students. So that's where it struck me that there needed to be this sense of a student belonging. And I just want to tell a story right now because it really hits home for me on how I feel like I connect in this way. I grew up in the Central Valley in California, in what Paul Tough calls a working class family. I guess I never really thought about it that way. But boy, I didn't know what universities were. I didn't know what professionals were. I didn't know that there was such a thing as engineers, even when I went off to college. And so I always had this sense of being an outsider in higher education. And when I first went off to college, I felt that very much. But the conversation I'm going to tell you, or the story I'm going to tell you about right now is a funny one. It's actually about me as an adult. Paul Tough wrote an article about the start of this initiative that was in the New York Times Magazine. And as a result, I ended up being asked to give talks in various places, including being asked to give a talk by the Texas Philosophical Society. I wasn't really sure what they were, but I looked it up and it appeared to be filled with very smart people. It had lots of the really smart people at UT, but it also had former governors and state senators, US senators, all these folks. So I drive down to Houston to a 5-star hotel, and I parked my beat up old minivan on the street because I didn't want it to go through valet parking. And then I went in and got up the next morning and went down to this glorious ballroom. And I looked into the ballroom and I saw a collection of people sitting there who looked so much more impressive than me. But even though I was the guy giving the plenary lecture, I grabbed a bagel and I went back upstairs. And at 10 o'clock, I came down and I started the talk that I was going to give, which is not all that different than the talk you're hearing. Well, I let them know honestly what it felt like to not belong. I said, you know, I just felt like I couldn't go in there for breakfast. I didn't feel like I belonged. So I felt so much more comfortable in my room. And somebody in the audience yelled, but you could have sat with me. And I said, you don't understand. It's not what you are like, it's what I felt. And that's one of the things we really need to appreciate is we can think we're doing the greatest job in the world of making a place of belonging, but that's not going to alter what the experiences are that people go through that feel like they don't belong. And so that's one of the things that I had to work on really hard, because to me, unless I could make those sorts of changes occur, then we weren't going to be able to make true headway on the graduation rate front. Now, I also did something that is somewhat controversial, but I'm a scientist and I love data and I love statistics and I believe in them. So it was important for me to use predictive analytics to answer questions about how I should spend the resource I had. What I was interested in was an outcome which was four-year graduation rates. It doesn't take a lot to be able to look at historical data and do predictive work to assign a likelihood of graduating in 4 years to every single student who showed up at UT. The factors that we used were the ones that were available to us. They included everything from the high school you went to, the AP courses you took, your class rank, how much money your parents made. There were 11 altogether. And interestingly, they did not allow us to use gender or ethnicity because UT was in the middle of legal battles. But we used these factors to allow us to come up with every student's likelihood of graduating in 4 years. And being the pragmatist I was, I thought, well, whatever resource I have, I'm going to spend on the people who are least likely to graduate based upon historically UT Austin not doing well by them. I mean, that was always my perspective of this. It wasn't about the student, it was about UT and whether it was doing its job. So the money went into two forms. One of them was an expansion of the TIP program that I had created in 1999, so that all of the incoming students at UT Austin who fell into this category of being least likely to graduate in 4 years got access to what we call the success programs. Just a brief background on this. In 1999, when I was teaching freshman chemistry, I saw this bimodal distribution create for my introductory chemistry course, where I had a bunch of students who weren't passing the course. And I had not had that situation arise before. And so the question became, why is that? And then I sort of scratched around and I found out that there was this new thing called automatic admissions at UT, which had guaranteed admission to the top 10% of students from across the state, regardless of what high school they went to. And what that ended up doing was delivering to UT a student population that, if you look at the characteristics for the population, were in many ways very different. They were much more likely to be Pell Grant eligible, much more likely to be first generation. And you could see it numerically, very simply by looking at the SAT score. The average SAT for this population was close to 1,000 on the two-score test, as opposed to 1,300 for UT. And so I thought to myself, well, I can't just continue to have this group of students not do well. I'm throwing them into this big 500 student classroom in which nobody seems to care about them. So this is where I created the TIP program. And in the TIP program, what I wanted for these students was to have the sense of a small college experience. I wanted them to be taught by the best teachers. I don't believe in remediation. I had supplemental instruction and advising. We had peer mentoring. We built communities. And the end result of this was the next year when I implemented TIP, I taught my regular course at 2 o'clock and had my 500 students get their distribution. And then I taught my TIP students at 3:30, a group of 50 of them. And I saw that in this new learning environment where there's this sense of belonging and caring, that in fact, these students would thrive. And they ended up getting the same kinds of grades in that course as my larger student course. And it was at that point I had this real realization about things like standardized tests. I never thought much of standardized tests because I'm not very good at them myself personally. But in particular, what this effort with TIP did was point out that students who had SAT scores that were well below the average for an institution could do just fine if they were given the attention they needed in that first year. And so in fact, that's what I looked to do across the university when we were trying to improve four-year graduation rates. Every college, liberal arts, undergraduate studies, business, engineering, had their own version of that success program. The other thing that we did was create the University Leadership Network for our 500 most economically disadvantaged students. These students were all Pell Grant eligible, but we also wanted to make a resource available to them so it could help them to pay for college, but I wanted to do it in a way that helped to foster a sense of belonging. So I want to tell you what this typical student would have been like if they had come to UT without the ULN. The first thing that would have happened is they would not have settled in on campus. It's too expensive to live on campus or to live in West Campus. They would most likely have been in one of the apartment complexes. Back then, it was Riverside Drive. It's no longer cheap, but it used to be quite inexpensive. You would have 2, 3, 4 people to a small apartment. They would get on a bus, drive through rush hour traffic, get to UT, take a class, and try to get back home to their apartment as fast as they could. They worked on Riverside Drive. They had almost no connection to the university. And you can imagine how in that particular situation, they have no particular stake in wanting to be able to stay. And that's why you saw the rather substantial attrition rates that occurred for this student population. So what we wanted to do was not just give them additional financial resources to be able to attend, but we also wanted them to feel that they in fact did belong to the university. We had substantial first-year leadership training, and after that, we had multi-year internships in which campus partners, on the order of 800 or so of them, opened their doors and had these students come and sit there with them. So that instead of feeling like you had no place to go when you were on campus, you could walk into pretty much any office, a museum, a library, the athletics building, the president's office. Everybody had a ULN intern in there. And they now had a place where they could go where they would have somebody to talk to, somebody to care about them, somebody who believed in them. And it was enormously inspiring to see this kind of enthusiasm rally around the student population. Well, we brought in 500 students a year into the program. So we're talking about 2,000 students, a pretty hefty number sitting in there. And there's former President Fenves with the first graduating class of ULN students. This right here is about 2,000 students in 2017. And the question was, did the work that we do actually pay off? And what ended up happening was the ULN students went from a likelihood of graduating at 33% to 55%, and that number is today over 65%. The TIP students who were at a 39% went to 60%, and they're now over 65%. So we saw this big change, and we were very appreciative of the fact that something actually seemed to be working along the way for those students. So I was really pleased that this occurred. Now, having said that, I can talk about where I was in all of this. When I started looking at the data, the predictive analytics, and I asked myself, who isn't graduating? It was real simple. It was the students coming from economic disadvantage. It was the overriding factor that determined whether you graduated or not. And we all have to appreciate that, why that's so real. Your economic status is going to dictate everything from the quality of your school district to the quality of the food you eat to the stability of the home life. Absolutely everything figures into this. So it wasn't surprising for me to be aware of the fact that this mattered. And then something important occurred. I was asked to give a talk at a conference on the future of higher education. Actually, it was a panel, and I showed up in New York City for this at the New York Times conferencing center. And you can get a sense about how much people cared about student success. This was like a 3-day conference, and they gave 30 minutes to student success. So I'm on this panel with 4 people, and each of us gets our turn to be able to talk about something. And at this point, I'm going to stop and tell you about Dave, the teacher-centered teacher. In my 4th year at UT, I won a major teaching award in the college, and I had to give a talk on this. And I mention this because I look back on this and I shudder at my behavior at that talk. I stood up at that dinner and I started telling them a story about how good a teacher I had become. I told them that I used to teach about nuclear magnetic resonance, or MRI as people refer to it today, and nobody could learn it. And then one day in class, I jumped up on a classroom desk and acted out being a bulk magnetization vector. And the students enjoyed watching that and all. And then I gave the test, and the students all did really well on that particular question. And I was very pleased with my teaching. And I remember arrogantly looking up and saying something along the lines of, 1 perfect lecture down, 32 to go. And oh my gosh, my skin crawls at that perspective, because it was all about me. And I think we all need to stop and think about this sometimes. How often are we so in love with our teaching that we don't think about what our real responsibility is? So when it became my turn to talk, and of course I was the last one to talk, and I had 2 minutes instead of 7 minutes, I had to come up with something, and I had this epiphany. And this epiphany, this pivotal change in my life, came with me looking up and not even knowing I was going to say this, but this is what I said. I said, you know, I've been teaching 500 student section chemistry courses for 20 years, 500 in the fall and 500 in the spring, 1,000 overall. That's 20,000 students I've taught. And, you know, I always thought I was a pretty good teacher. Students liked me, and I get my teaching awards and all. But it was also the case that I always didn't pass about 20% of my students. And so if you do the math, you realize that 4,000 of my students were having their hopes and dreams crushed by me in my classroom. And I looked up and I said, and I just want to say I'm sorry. Because it occurred to me that if I was asked this honest question, how much did you do on behalf of those students to make sure that they could succeed? The answer was, I didn't do anything at all. I spent my time being quite happy to be around the A students, being able to give them TA positions and doing research in my laboratory. And I just assumed that that 20% was supposed to be there. I mean, somebody had to not do well so that everybody else could succeed. And it was in that moment I realized I had to do something to create an environment in which I felt like every student would succeed. And I had to ask myself what that would entail. I now will give you a sort of a timeout to tell you about what what large section science courses are like in universities. We all know this. Lots of people don't pass. At UT Austin, the typical non-passing rates in large section courses were anywhere between 20 and 50%. And for me, in working on 4-year graduation rates, it's occurred to me that, my goodness, if you do the math, if 1 in every 4 seats in an introductory chemistry or calculus or biology class doesn't pass, there's no way I can make my graduation rates. So I had to do something about this. And as a little sort of anecdote, let me tell you that I was called to the provost office way back when I was in the college because a professor in the math department had created a brand new calculus course, and he was very well-meaning, but he ended up not passing 50% of his students. And so this prompted the provost to tell the dean's office we needed to do something about it. So I called a meeting with the folks who taught introductory courses. Well, we had lunch, and I posed a very simple question to them. I said, what percentage of our students should not pass our introductory science and math courses? And I went it as a fraction. So 1 out of 1, 1 out of 2, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5, what is it? And they were all very excited. They sat there at their table and they worked very hard at thinking of this. And then they ended up putting it in the context of a bell curve. And in a bell curve, where there's an A, a B, a C, a D, and an F, they told me that between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 students, 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 students shouldn't pass, because that's just the way it is. And I realized that I'd always accepted this as well. And then there was a problem that occurred. And the problem occurred where when I started thinking about this for the first time with actual data, I had to realize that there was a real downside, because I now was able to run predictive analytics on the students in my class. And I could ask myself very simply, which of my students will earn an A and which of my students will not? But I already now know this. The students who will do well are the economically advantaged students. The students who will do poorly are on average the students coming from economic disadvantage. And that was such a downer for me, because I would so much rather have been able to be agnostic, because all of you as teachers appreciate what it's like In the fall, you get to walk in and you look up at your class and say, welcome class, let's do some learning. And yet the die has already been cast. We aren't really doing a whole lot to change things if we continue to perpetuate the idea that the affluent will get the A's and that the economically disadvantaged will not. We don't think about it in that context because we're never given access to that data. But I now had it, and I now carried this with me when I was in the classroom. And I realized that I could be a good teacher or I could be a terrible teacher, but unless I changed, the A students would get the A's and the F students would get the F's, and things would never get better. So what was I supposed to do about this? I'll tell you the first thing I did, and this was in some ways the most profound. This is a picture of my classroom I found on the internet. It's kind of creepy what you can find on the internet. There's me in front of 500 students. On the first day of class in fall of 2013, about 2 weeks after giving that talk at the New York Times, I walked into the middle of the classroom. And I stood there with him and I said, I want you to know that I'm on your side. I'm going to do everything I can to ensure that every one of you can achieve the goals you have. And you have to understand, I was in a 500 student freshman pre-med chemistry course. For every one of these students, they knew that getting an A was what they had to do. If they didn't get that A, their chances of going to medical school were going to go down. So I was up there in the middle of them saying, I'm on your side and I'm going to make this happen somehow, some way. And that meant I had to let them know that this was a possibility. And I came to realize later what a huge change this was for me. And I can give you evidence of this, and it comes in this form. The year before, when I stood in the front of them, and I didn't say that I was on their side, after that first test, the grade distribution was created, and about 20% of the students didn't pass. And I'm required, as are all faculty, to send the obligatory email to all of the non-passing students telling them to come to my office. And as was always the case, none of them did. I mean, why on earth would somebody who's brand new to college and has just failed their first chemistry test want to go and sit for 20 minutes in some 6'4", 250-pound old white guy's office while he reminds them that they failed to succeed? So of course nobody came. The next year, when I walked into the middle of the class and told them that I was on their side and that I believed in them and that I knew that I could help them reach their goal, when I sent that email out after the first test, that night, there were 50 or 60 emails that came back. And it was one of the most jaw-dropping experiences I had to appreciate what it's like, because I really had changed. It was such a weird thing to think that I was more concerned about them than I was about my own lectures. I had to do lots of things with that class, and it's my course, so I was doing it to honor the way I teach. But one of the first things I did was I told them while I was up there in the middle of them that they had a responsibility to each other, that if they weren't willing to commit themselves to working together as a community to make sure that everyone was successful, I'd rather they go to another class. So I asked them to turn and welcome themselves to the people to the left, to the right, in front and back, and to make that promise that you would help them to be successful. Many years earlier, I had created a collection of videos that I put online in 2002, and then again in 2008, and then again in 2012, each of them with increasing quality, that basically flipped my classroom and made available to the students 24/7 access to what it is that I wanted them to learn. I converted my course over to active learning in the classroom. And in that particular environment, I stopped lecturing and they did most of the thinking and talking because they'd already seen what I wanted them to see the night before. And instead, I realized that my primary job was to facilitate and motivate. And in my particular perspective, that meant, for example, taking a student who hadn't done well on a test and spending 20 minutes with them, talking to them about how to be successful. Facilitation meant thinking always, what's keeping a student from getting a better grade? It meant that I turned my classes in many ways over into places where I taught students how to do well on exams, because the truth of the matter is the students who weren't doing well on my tests were students who had never learned to study effectively for a college level rigorous multiple choice test. So I wasn't the least bit embarrassed to spend time in that classroom teaching students how to game the multiple choice test. I mean, after all, that's what happens when you go find an SAT tutor that you pay $80 an hour so you can get your 1570, is to have them say, here, let me show you how to game the SAT. Well, I was smart enough to figure out how to game my course, and I taught those tricks to my students, and they really rallied around them because for so many of these students, they finally knew how to study. I also was very intent on making sure that my students weren't held hostage to an academic calendar. I remember walking into class a few years ago and looking at them and saying, I know that many of you are struggling right now, and it's not academic, it's something else. There's a book by, oh, I forget his name now, but it's called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And the book makes a very good point that our brains are only ever to do one hard thing well at a time. So when you're running a marathon, you're not doing complicated math, you're not sweating any sort of emotional issues. When it's time to study for a test though, how do you handle the emotional challenges that come because you've just found out that your mother has cancer, or you're suffering from mental illness? So I told the students that all they had to do was tell me if they were at a place in their learning where they felt they couldn't concentrate on my course. And it was amazing. I had this outpouring of somewhere between 80 and 100 students who sent me emails saying, I'm not ready to study for your test right now. I didn't tell them they had to tell me what it was, but over and over again, they felt they could trust me to tell me about a serious injury or an illness, or in some cases, there's just saying things like, I broke up with my girlfriend and I can't think. And I said, that's okay. It's okay for you to take that time. Being able to do that sort of thing, I think, sort of was liberating for me to know that I was not so obsessed with trying to follow all the rules that had to be put into place to make sure I honored what the university wanted more than the students themselves. So what happened to my grades? Well, I screwed up the bell curve. In the year 2000, I had, and I need to fix this slide, so I apologize for not being out of date, but in the year 2000, I had maybe 100 students get an A and maybe 100, 150 students not pass. When I flipped my classroom, about 200 students were getting A's and about 70 or so weren't passing. When I started creating community in the classroom in 2013, another gigantic rise in overall success. And these days, my A's in that class are somewhere in the range of 350 students. And the number of students who aren't passing, I can count on my hand, and I know every one of them by name and tried everything I could to help them to be successful. This has been, as I said, such a liberating feeling for me. I don't teach anymore. I don't walk into class and give great lectures on entropy. I assume that's going to happen through the resources I provide. Mostly, I've just become somebody who cares about every one of my students being successful. And I think in terms of what this means, now that I am student-centered this way, it means that I'm now fulfilling, I think, some of my societal responsibility. If I feel like now I've created a situation where there may be 100 students in my class who had been denied the opportunity to go to medical school or become an engineer. Now they still have that hope. And I have this idea that if this can continue and that this is the way we think about how we educate our students moving into the future, that's going to be a win for everyone. I'm not going to say very much about this, just to let you know I wasn't the only one thinking about these things. The university created course transformation projects in biology, chemistry, and statistics, and asked the faculty to start thinking about how to be more student-centered. And I was stunned to see the results, that it wasn't just about me. The chemistry non-passing rates went way down. The biology non-passing rates went way down. The statistics non-passing rates went way down. And now we're at a point where in the College of Natural Sciences, in our large section classes, look at these non-passing rates. They're close to not there. And there's such a different attitude, by the way. I'm embarrassed for us in chemistry. We used to be at 5%, something happened. But look at calculus, a 4% non-passing rate. That's just an amazing result, all because of the attitude of the faculty of becoming more student-centered. Putting this in context for the university, as Kim pointed out, we started to see that dramatic rise in graduation rates. But the important thing for me wasn't the rise for the students coming from affluence. You see them in that top graph, they didn't change much. It was the students that were in that quartile least likely to graduate that saw this more than 50% improvement in their graduation rates. Put in terms of students by ethnicity, Hispanic students, Latinx students went from 40 to 60%, African American students from 35 to 57. Pell Grant eligible, the same sorts of trends, first generation, the same sorts of trends. And it was just such an exciting thing to see that the folks that we wanted most to put the resource into would be successful. I'm going to finish up now by offering just a couple of comments and hope I haven't gone over my time, and I apologize if I have, but I'm old, and talk about grades. As you can tell, I have a fairly radical view of grades. And I'm not exactly the favorite of other chemistry faculty or other folks at the university who think I suffer from grade inflation issues and that I'm doing a disservice to the university or something like this. These are people who, on the one hand, expect us to graduate our students, but on the other hand, want us to continue to give lots of C's and D's and F's to them. I know as well, though, I can get away with it. I was an administrator, so while people would talk behind my back about how I was some kind of easy teacher or something, I could do it because I had tenure and I was their boss. I understand the challenges that come when you aren't in that particular position, when your high school or your institution holds you accountable to that bell curve. But I do want to talk about an interesting thing that happened on the other side of the pandemic. After spring break, I assume we all woke up the next day and realized that we had to teach online. And this prompted a lot of soul searching by institutions, high schools and universities. How do we grade? At UT Austin, the faculty council decided that we were pretty much going to put grades in the hands of the students. The students had until 2 weeks after the courses ended to make the simple decision to either keep the grade or to change it to pass fail, or to drop it entirely, no penalty. What I experienced in my class when that happened, where I had my 500 diligent, hyper stressed out pre-meds, is the release that occurred when that went away. And it was a palpable feeling I had from them. They felt like they didn't have to be constantly looking over their shoulder at the grading. The other interesting thing that happened was I stopped being able to effectively proctor exams. I had no good way to do this for my students that didn't advantage my advantaged students. So I simply made everything open book. The natural consequence of that was my grades went up yet another amount. And yet I always felt, my students were doing their homework, they were taking daily quizzes, they were showing up and taking my exams, and then they were just using the internet the way we do as adults to go out and get the information they needed. The end result of that was my grades went up even again, and I had over 400 A's this time. One might ask, what was that like? Did they really do their learning? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that they were happier. I felt this even in my own children who were in high school, who suddenly were told that they could study for the last quarter, but the grades that they'd gotten from the third quarter would be the grades they'd use. It couldn't go down. And suddenly they were light and easy about their studying. My son, who hates math, hates advanced algebra, actually was more likely to participate now that he didn't have that sort of burden of what's that grade going to look like. So then I look forward and I think, what's coming next? And when I think about what's coming next, I ask myself, what's going to be happening this fall? In the fall, I'll be teaching online, so the students have 24/7 access to my materials. I'm going to be able to form breakout rooms with Zoom so my students can go do lots of active learning with each other. I have incredible flexibility over my calendar so that I can give tests whenever I need it. In the spring, my goodness, students who were in quarantine, I gave them tests 2 weeks later. Students who had to work, I gave them tests at 1 o'clock in the morning. Whatever they needed, they were able to get. I realized that in this fall, I'm going to have to continue to do this, but the only thing that I haven't fixed yet is how to assess. I don't think the university is going to give me a proctoring capability that I'm going to be happy with. So I'm entirely possible in the fall simply going to continue to teach the way I did this spring, where grades stopped being the thing that mattered most. And it makes me wonder, really, I wonder what's coming in the future. What if this is what we're confronted by? Maybe it's going to be the case that grades stop being the important thing and we can get back to the point where just creating and nurturing an environment for learning is our priority responsibility, and we leave the assessment for someone else. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm going to give the floor back over to Kim and the people who are in charge of things, and I hope this went okay.
Thank you, David, so much. So Jason, are you able to put myself, Steve, and David all on camera so that we can talk to one another?
You're all on camera.
Okay, great, awesome. So I've been watching the Q&A fly by during your talk. And so I'm gonna ask the first question, Steve, and then I'll let you decide what you want to ask as a follow-up. So there was a question about how the fundamental ideas that you talked about transfer specifically to K-12 classrooms. About half our audience are K-12 teachers joining us today. And this was from Pat McGuire, and he said, it seems most of the core ideas are transferable, but what suggestions do you have about specifically addressing K-12 teachers, in particular secondary STEM, wanting to improve student success or graduation rates?
Well, my course actually is taught in high schools. I'm fortunate to participate in the On-Ramps program. For those of you who are not aware of it, this was an initiative started at UT Austin, sort of as an alternative to AP courses or IB courses, where UT Austin courses are delivered out into high schools across the state. And it's become enormously popular, especially with Title I schools. And I won't go too much into the detail of it all, but right now, my Chem 301 class in the fall is going to be taught to 120 different classes, high school classes, and about 4,000 students. And I can tell you that I am required to make sure that the way I teach my course at UT is exactly taught that way in the high school. So everything I said here, every aspect of it, is something the students experience. My easy sort of way of answering is, been there, done that, it works great. But I very much appreciate actually what it's like to be able to walk into a high school classroom and say to the teachers, you know, I want us all to walk in there every day and tell the students that we're on their side and we're going to do everything we can to help them be successful. And to just talk like that. So in professional development sorts of meetings, like the ones I just finished last week, we continue to reinforce this idea that being on the student side matters most. And it's been really wonderful to see that that's the attitude of the faculty in that teaching. I will say that I ended up the professional development last week by talking for a few minutes about how, because of the pandemic, there were issues with proctoring, and maybe one of these days we would get away from grading. And it was interesting. About 2/3 of the high school teachers said yes, because they're all very Pollyannish-y, wanting to, just like you, Dr. Laude, who needs grades? I just want my students to love to learn. But another third of them were kind of grumpy about it. They said, yeah, good luck with that. Do you know what my institution is expecting of me? You have no idea the pressures they put on me with respect to how assessment is done. So I think that this is an opportunity for us to start having these kinds of questions about how things are in fact going to change in the fall. I can't imagine that the 120 high school teachers all across the state of Texas who are going to have to teach in multiple modes without any effective kinds of proctoring tools or anything else are going to be able to hold to some sort of extraordinarily rigorous notion of how you grade. Anybody who does do that, I think it's a fool's errand. I think we're going to have to start to adopt a more open-minded view of it. But in response to that question that was asked, I love teaching my on-ramp students. It's just a ball. Being able to reach out to work with them and to work with the high school teachers who facilitate the learning in the classroom. It's a one-to-one map of everything I do into the high school.
I was going to follow up, and you've already addressed this on grading, because grading is a wicked problem at all levels of learning and schooling, formal schooling. We tend to use grades to rank and sort students, and judgments for acceptance to college and acceptance across different ways, rather than addressing mastery learning and giving feedback to learners about what they know, understand, and are able to do. You already touched on the next question that's in here. In that particular circumstance, how do you change the culture to shift awareness so that math and science departments, more instructors, chairs, and deans are aware of this needed shift? And I would extend that down into K-12. Frequently, administration is not supportive of this kind of teaching, and specifically when it comes down to grades. What can we do to shift and change the culture?
I sort of want to put this question back on you and say, give me a break. They can't have it both ways. What I mean by that is people talk about the need to get more economically disadvantaged students, more students of color into the professions, for example, to have more physicians, to have more engineers. And then they turn around and put into place a system that selects against that every step of the way. When honor students show up at UT, I'm very passionate about this. It just annoys me to no end. When honor students show up at UT, they've been selected almost exclusively because their SAT score reflects their excellence in everything they do. And so when they walk in and sit down, I say to them, I just want you to know, whatever you want to do next, it's already locked in place. Because a 1570 at SAT at UT Austin is a guarantee of a 3.9 and a really high MCAT score. So just relax, you've already won. I mean, just think about that we've created a system that favors that population of students so much that unless somebody's willing to come in and disrupt it, it's just going to continue as it has before. My comment that I made earlier, I could have been a great teacher, I could have been a terrible teacher. The A students were going to get the A's. The rich students were going to get the A's. So thinking about what has to happen, I would hope the message that I offer about who it is that's being disserved is understood. I gave a talk at a large public research institution that is notorious for not passing its students. It loves what it calls weed out courses. And so there was a new dean there, and she wanted me to come and give a talk to all the faculty teaching the large section courses. And so I'm in there, and you could immediately see the room divide in half. There were the people who were throwing things at me, and there were the people who were silently nodding in agreement. And so I gave my talk, and I'm not sure how many people it converted, but it was very simply about the idea that the people who are not passing your courses are the people coming from disadvantage. I just want you to know that. You don't get to be agnostic anymore. Later that summer, I get a phone call from a faculty member in the physics department who told me that there was a war going on in this department. He said, there are those who want to change and those that don't. And he says, I used to not want to change, but now every time I think about it, I just can't believe I'm going to be spending my time failing kids because they're poor. It's being able to educate, I think, our faculty and our administrators that there's more to the reason we have college than making sure that the elite continue to thrive and realize what our actual, much more important mission is supposed to be. I know I'm giving you these sorts of Pollyannish, we can do it sorts of things, but it stuns me that administrations don't understand that they are participating in this while at the same time talking out the other side of their mouths about how much they care.
Is now our moment to disrupt this system?
Well, that's why I was so, I'm not kidding. It was so funny to listen to faculty in my department who are not typically known for being kinder and gentler, talking about how we needed to be very sensitive to the students and to their needs. And folks who I never thought would say things like, you know, there are kids who have to go to work now because their parents lost their jobs, or, you know, there are kids who don't have access to technology. So suddenly a room filled with faculty who might not in the past have thought that their job was anything other than to find the next generation of chemistry professors was in fact thinking about students first. And so I have this very fond hope that come the fall, that will happen too, that will continue. That was the sort of thing I think that I most appreciated, was the irony that the one thing that I can't do well online is assess. So maybe that will end up going away.
Okay, so we have a question about, you talked about working specifically with those bottom quartile students on giving them access to some of the things that the more economically advantaged students take for granted, like study tips, management tips, the whole academic calendar navigation thing, and giving them flexibility. There's a question about what could you share from what you've done at the university level that would be relevant to K-12 teachers with regard to this?
So I wonder about this. Let's just talk about the idea about how to get an A on a test. I think oftentimes we as faculty don't believe it's our responsibility to teach students how to get a good grade on a test. We believe it's our job to deliver content. And so having delivered that content, the students, depending upon the environment that they are in, will sort of move along the path that will be successful for them. So a very, very typical sort of way this would happen in schools is you might have a teacher who doesn't really know the material all that well, but they need for their students to be successful. So they make a practice exam that looks pretty much exactly like the regular exam. And they hand out the exam the day before, and the students all learn, if you can learn to do that practice exam, you're going to be able to get the regular exam right. I actually had to stop having practice exams in my class because so many students moved immediately to that, because that's how they got through high school. That's how they graduated at the top of their class in high school, but it wasn't going to be successful for them in college. So when I realized I had to replace that, I had to come up with a rethinking, a deconstructing how it is that you study to do well on a test that's multiple choice. And so on the very first day of class, I put up something called How to Get an A on a Multiple Choice Test. And I don't know how good it is or not, but my students seem to like it. And that's what I train them around. So to believe that I actually spend the first week of class teaching students how to bubble in answers correctly on a multiple choice test, something that the students coming from privilege have no issue with. But for the students who've never seen this before, it's a huge change for them. When students come to my office after not doing well on a test, I actually spend a half an hour with them working through the process of learning how to study that way. And so if I had anything to offer back into the high school classroom, it would be to appreciate that a lot of students simply don't know how to do the studying they need to do to be effective, and that to spend time on that rather than focusing on the content isn't such a terrible idea.
The next question you've already touched on a little bit, but time is kind of our exchange commodity in teaching and learning. How specifically do you facilitate a student-centered classroom when under the time constraint? Time being that very linear function where there's a beginning and an end to our courses.
Well, I was thinking about it in a different context for just a second. You're quite right. The reason I'm able to do for my class what I need to do for my class is because I give the time to it. You know, people are surprised when I say, yes, I hold 70 30-minute conversations with each individual student who doesn't do well on the first test. And they say, you've got to be kidding. And I said, no, it's not hard. You just take 70 students times 30 minutes and you can fit it into the week. You just have to make it your priority. Now, I'm not doing research anymore, but I'm passionate about my students being successful. So for me, time spent that way is something that I'm very much committed to doing. And in fact, I've worked with lots of high school teachers through the on-ramps program, but I know that there are folks in that group who feel the same way. They view each and every one of their students as somebody that they need to put the time into. And there's no getting away from that. I mean, technology can only do so much for us in that regard. But with respect to the issue of calendaring, I am hopeful that one of the things that's going to come out of this is that there becomes this greater flexibility with respect to when and how students do their learning. I mean, online learning through, for example, the for-profit institutions in the country has been around for a while, where you take your tests, you watch your lectures when you have the time to do it. And I'm hopeful that we're going to be breaking down some of that because of being in this online environment. Anyway, that's my perspective on time. You're right, there's no getting around the fact that time is limited and you've got to make it a priority that this is what you need to do for your students. And I've been blessed that this is something that I have the opportunity to do.
So there's a question about, do you have any data on how your students do from your class after they leave, or like what their particular graduation or success rates are compared to others?
Sure. This is kind of funny. While I was at this one institution, I had a faculty member who was feeling pretty grumpy stand up and look at me and say, but do your students master the material? And I said, well, what do you mean by mastery? And he said, well, you know what I mean by mastery. I mean, do they master it? And I said, well, if by mastering the material, do you mean, do they go on to be successful in subsequent coursework? And he said, well, sure. And I started to answer, and it was kind of funny. And he said, but wait, no, do your students do their homework? And it was like the weirdest sentence. And I said, well, of course my students do their homework. And he said, no, they don't. And I said, yes, they do. And he says, I don't believe you. And I thought, wow, what a weird thing. But I realized he had this attitude about teaching in general and his contempt for his students. And I'm thinking, if I was one of your students, I wouldn't want to do your homework either. But getting back to the issue of how my students do, it's really easy to find out. If my students do so badly in my class, then it will show up very clearly in a drop in graduation rates. And in fact, my students persist to do just as well in organic chemistry and on to graduate as everyone else. And I think one of the things we need to appreciate about this is that oftentimes we put too much influence on how important we think our class is. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but just remember, these students are in college for 4 years. They're taking at least 40 classes. They're having 1 million experiences inside and outside the classrooms that are allowing them to grow as human beings. Is it really the case that whether they do or don't know Hess's law is going to be the important driver on whether they're going to be a decent human being when they get older? I think sometimes for us in our classroom, we think that we have this enormous responsibility to protect society from letting students get loose with a chemistry degree who didn't earn it. And I think we need to get off our high horse and realize that we're just not that special in that way. But my short answer is, yes, I've looked at the data. My students actually do better overall. And students would not flock to my course to take it if it was resulting in students then failing organic the next semester. And by the way, how could it be otherwise? All we do is study. I mean, it's just this amazing learning environment in which kids want to learn. And that's what they're being rewarded for.
I'm going to put a quick plug in here, Kim, for the UC network and for our K-12 educators who can be affiliates in UC, and for our universities. We collect a tremendous amount of data about our students' success as teachers, and using that data to evaluate whether we're meeting our students' needs and goals is really important. And that's an important function of our collaboration and our networking together here. And following up on what David is saying about his students, these are very successful human beings who are advancing the welfare of their students in K-12. And that's a really important part of this network.
So I'm going to ask the final question that we have time for, and it's specific about Zoom. So we all, made the shift to Zoom in the spring, and we're wondering how things changed related to your specific approach related to active learning in the Zoom environment.
So I'll say this. I had never turned on Zoom in my life. In fact, I take it back. I had done Zoom when I was doing on-ramps by having somebody from the on-ramp staff come to my office and click the Zoom button to get it started before spring break. So everything I learned about Zoom, I learned on my own afterward. And one of the things that I wasn't very good at initially was the notion of a breakout room and active learning. And so my initial efforts on that front weren't very successful. And for a few weeks, I sort of defaulted back to traditional lecture style. And it just felt awful. And the students like, why are you doing this to us? This is not what we do. And then I moved to breakout rooms again and learned how to manage them and to manage them effectively, and have found it to be enormously satisfying, and in fact, much easier and better to do with Zoom than it ever was in my awkward traditional lecture classrooms. I taught another course for students in the TIP program who were interested in going to medical school, where most of them were scared to death to talk in front of 100 people. But in a classroom where there were 20 small groups of 5 being led by a TA or a mentor, enormous good work was done because the students were put into a position where they were comfortable being able to talk. So I'm really excited this fall about this, this ability to move active learning into the breakout rooms that we're going to be using. I can't help but put a plug in for active learning and how important it is. Very simply, if students don't talk their discipline, they're not going to be successful with their discipline. And so as soon as I possibly can, I have them talking chemistry. And if that's what they're doing in lecture and that's what they're doing when they're studying, it has an enormous impact ultimately on their success with the class. And I think about how for 25 years, I never bothered to do that. I just talked to them and then told them to go study. Now they do all the talking. And it's going to be really exciting this fall to put this into place. I know we're about to finish up. I just want to say, this was my personal journey, my personal experience, and I appreciate all of you coming from very different places. I'm just telling you that I have never had so much fun teaching as I do right now. I feel like these enormous burdens have been lifted from me, and I'm fortunate to be in a situation where people maybe leave me alone that wouldn't leave you alone when it comes to how I assess and how I teach. But it's a good feeling, it's a good place to be, and I hope all of you can get to your good places as well.